The Projection Booth podcast is sponsored by Scarecrow Video. Try out Scarecrow's rent-by-mail service. Choose from over 150,000 films and get Blu-rays, 4Ks, and DVDs delivered directly to your door. Visit scarecrow.com today.
Hold your ears, folks. It's showtime.
People pay good money to see this movie. When they go out to a theater, they want cold sodas, hot popcorn, and no monsters in the projection booth.
Everyone pretend podcasting isn't boring.
Turn it off.
Turn it off.
Es gibt 1000 andere Möglichkeiten, sich das Leben zu nehmen. Warum fahren Sie gegen eine Wand?
Wer sagt Ihnen, dass sie mich umbringen wollte?
Es gab keine Bremsspuren.
Ich schlag die Fresse an.
Willst du mich heiraten?
Tu doch nur so, als wären wir verheiratet, verstehst du?
Wieso gar nicht? Ich bin Penner!
Weil meine Eltern nicht akzeptieren würden, du bist ein starker Mann!
Falsche Fuchse.
Ja, das bin ich.
Du liebst sie. Ja. Ich lieb sie.
Hör auf. Wenn wir es tun, dann bin ich deine Frau und du bist mein Mann.
Wenn Sie Ihr Leben beenden wollen, dann beenden Sie doch Ihr Leben, aber dafür müssen Sie doch nicht sterben.
Welcome to the Projection Booth. I'm your host, Mike White. Joining me once again is Mr. Keith Gordon.
Hello, hello.
Also back in the booth is Ms. Rain Alexander.
Hey, glad to be back.
We are starting a month of mostly listener requests with one from Jordan Nash. That's Fatih Akin's Head On. Released in 2004, the film stars, bear with me here, and bear with me with all these names, Birol Ünel as Cahit and Sibel Kekilli as Sibel, two Turkish people living in Germany. They also share a desire to end it all, Sibel by slashing her wrists and Cahit by giving us the title of the film as he crashes his car head-on into a wall after a drunken night. Sibel is in need of a husband in name only to get her parents off her back, while Cahil needs to torture himself some more. We will be spoiling this film as we go along, so if you don't want anything ruined, please turn off the podcast and come back after you've seen it. So, Rain, when was the first time you saw Head On, and what did you think?
I saw this pretty soon after it came out. It's hard to put a finger on it because I feel like I saw it earlier than it was available, right? Sometime in that early 2000s, but it was probably around 2005, probably on home video. And I loved this film instantly for many, many reasons that I think we'll get into in the longer discussion. It scratches a particular itch that I feel like I get less and less of in cinema, that Fassbinder itch, these really bleak and yet sweeping romances, right?
And Keith, how about yourself?
Ooh, can I just say ditto? It's actually kind of similar. As a film fan person, I'm always keeping my eyes out for things and ears out for things. And I don't remember, I read some article that mentioned it. I think it might have been a Jonathan Rosenbaum review of something else that mentioned it, or so there was something that mentioned it. Oh, that sounds interesting. And in my way, I tracked down, I think it was the UK DVD because it was the only one that was out. And it just blew me away. I mean, became and has stayed one of my very favorite films. It's more for all those wonderful ineffable qualities than for anything about the plot. It's one of those movies, if you try to describe, can sound, that sounds okay. I mean, it sounds a little like this or a little like that, but it's not like anything. And that it made me fall in love with not just this film, but I don't know if it's Akın or Akins. I think it's Akın, but I'm embarrassed. I don't know the right pronunciation. But I fell in love with I started working my way through all his films and realizing just what an amazingly protean and talented filmmaker he is. But this one's my very favorite. The mix of humor and darkness and pain and light and hopelessness and hopefulness and cool music and wonderful editing and cinema. This is one of those things where all the elements fed each other and made something even bigger than the sum of its parts. And I found it deeply, deeply moving and haunted me. And I just, seen it now a whole bunch of times. And I'm really glad we're getting to talk about it, because it's one of those movies that I always tell people about. Like when people say, well, what's a good movie I don't know about? This is on my short list. So I'm really glad we're getting to maybe get a few more people who want to see it.
I think you're right. I think it is Akın. And if I said Akın, like Clay Aiken earlier, I apologize. But reading versus hearing, I read those intros and I knew his name walking into this, and then of course screwed it up. And I'm really glad that Jordan Nash asked for this one, because I had heard of this film, but I had never seen it. And so this was a real treat for me to be able to experience this for the first time for the show. And yeah, this kind of star-crossed lovers kind of thing. And yeah, just the misery shared by a couple. Yeah, it's right there. I love that kind of stuff too. And this is so much better than, there's a really nice book written about this movie, and the author is talking about other films that are somewhat similar, and they brought up Green Card. I was like, oh yeah, I remember Green Card. This is a lot better than Green Card. Not to say that Green Card is a bad movie, but this was so much better and so much what I'm looking for. And I just love these kind of self-destructive characters who are clinging to each other and yet pushing each other away. This whole idea of Sibel trying to, I don't know, she just wants to get married, to get her family off of her back. And they want this, well, I don't know how much he wants it, but she definitely wants this open relationship where she can go and mess around with anybody, encourages him to mess around with anybody. But of course, the inevitable happens and they start to fall in love, and then a bigger tragedy ensues. I just love stories like this.
I hinted that at this when I made my first remarks, but this is a film that I kind of went into it with a misreading of it as a queer film, right? And specifically as a trans film, for many, many reasons. I had a friend in the early 2000s who had been in Europe and who had started a relationship with a Turkish trans woman who was really trying to get away from what her life was in Turkey. And so it was a little bit informed by that, but I had also been tipped off. I'm not sure how I received this, but, I think as we see in the film, there is a lot of, kind of push-pull against the restrictions of gender, restrictions of the patriarchy. And so I went into this with this weird understanding that I was watching a film about a man and a trans woman in a relationship. And obviously this is not what the film is, but it was really hard for me to let go of that, especially as we get to see this kind of trans masculinization that happens to Sibel's character throughout the film. And even watching it through this time, knowing, and especially after hearing the commentary and realizing this is not an intention of the filmmakers at all, right? They did not go in to make a trans film, but I think this is the place where they kind of inadvertently did. I really can see a reading of this character, Sibel, as a trans man, as we might understand this kind of character now, who wants to get out of this family restrictions, who may still want to be a parent, but kind of do it on, for lack of, to do it on his terms, right? If we think about this character as a trans masculine character. There's lots of evidence to point against that, but I think that there's a reading in that I think is really potentially really complete, and I'm waiting for somebody who's a little smarter than me to put that into a film journal.
The transformation of these characters, her with the shorter hair later on, him at the beginning where he's got that beard and has to get himself cleaned up so that he can eventually ask for her hand in marriage in one of the most awkward scenes that I've seen in a long damn time. Just that whole thing with the family and his buddy who's pretending. It is just his buddy, right? He's no relationship, but they're pretending to be relations, and they can't get their stories straight, and they're contradicting each other. But I have to say, our main character, this is no shame to anybody who wears a beard. Yeah, I wear facial hair as well. But when he gets shaved at the beginning, oh my God, he becomes one of the most handsome people I've seen in a long damn time. He looks amazing.
You raise a really interesting point, and it's not an aspect of the film I'd focused on, but clearly, yes, there is a real play with gender roles in this that I think is an interesting element in terms of she is much more the sexual aggressor, she's much more sexual, what they fall into in terms of their behaviors. Definitely each of them has, he has a really feminine side for this guy that comes off as very masculine when we meet him, and he's kind of got this beard and he's edgy, and she's very pretty and slight physically, and yet their personalities, she has a strong masculine side, he has a strong feminine side, and it's part of what makes them such rich people. I mean, what I love about the film in general is the characters, their two characters particularly, are incredibly complicated, in a way you just don't get in movies very often. They're suicidal but life affirming. They're tragic and funny. They're shy and they're open. They're both very complicated, and I do think that among the richnesses of them is that they don't fit neatly into our gender suppositions about how this is going to go, because there have been a million movies about star-crossed lovers, have been a million movies about people getting married for convenience, have been a million. Everything about this sort of feels like, oh, I've seen that. And yet there's nothing about this movie that feels like, oh, I've seen that. And I think that it's part of what the brilliance of the filmmaking is that the way those elements are mashed up and the complexity and richness of the filmmaking and the acting and the writing, everybody is breaking all these cliches, and among them are definitely gender cliches. And it is an interesting way to think about the movie, because it goes all the way through the movie that neither of these people stick to what we would presuppose about how they behave in the world in their gender roles from the first 30 seconds we see them. We make all sorts of suppositions. They look very much in certain ways, and then the whole movie is them not being the way we think they're going to be.
We hear so early on, Cahit is asked if he's a faggot, and it's met with aggression. And his response is, I only have sex with men, I believe is the actual response. And I mean, from my very first watch of this, I'm like, oh, okay. So this is going to be about him negotiating that, maybe internalized homophobia. I'm not entirely sure. But of course, this is not what he seems to do for the rest of the film, apart from the fact that as we see in his sexual relations with Marin, he loves an aggressive sexual encounter. It's hardcore is not. It seems like not quite the right term for it. It's just they're wild. They go wild. They go ham.
I've never seen one of these star-crossed lover movies where when he turns down her marriage proposal, that the person breaks a beer bottle and slices their wrist right there, and blood sprays all over his face. I'm like, oh my God.
Well, it's a very punky film in that way. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, there's a lot of violence in the movie. There's a lot of violence. There's a lot of intense sex and intense sexuality. I mean, that's the thing. It's sort of like taking a movie like Green Card and going, okay, now, what would Fassbinder meets punk meets, do with this movie? And it gives it this whole other richness. And then underneath all that, when the tenderness comes out, I mean, the difference between our main character's sex when he has it with this woman who he's a very mixed relationship with, and it's intense, but it's also kind of weird and almost violent and not very emotional. And then when there's the emotional, connected, tender sex, it's a real interesting contrast. It's got this really tough punk veneer and this really soft heart with this movie. And I think that's part of why I find it so affecting, because it captures both sides and we all have that, we all have our fucked up, weird, angry, whatever bad parts of us that don't work. And, here's these suicidal people who are desperately trying to find ways to feel alive. I mean, everything is contradiction. And I think that that's something that Akın really plugs into in human beings, that, whatever we have, we also have the opposite. And the whole film keeps doing that, and it keeps you off balance because there's enough different and contradictory truths about these people that every time you think you know where the movie's going to go, where the story's going to go, and where the character's going to go, it's like, no, they're not. They're going to go somewhere new, and you're going to have to readjust again and open up to a new side of themselves as they're having to do, which I think is really interesting.
I've got my trans reading of this, but we've got this immigration upon immigration layering that's going in here. And we hear this idea repeated in the film. Effectively, if you don't like where you are, go somewhere else. Always be moving seems to be like the key of that, even if it does end up in the end that, he goes back to the place of his birth, which is also kind of like an interesting thing if you're looking at this from a trans narrative, because so many of us who are trans are always going to be tied back in uncomfortable ways to the places that we're born, even if we're still in the same nation that we are in, because of birth certificates. And that's increasingly the case with the Trump administration. But, but we hear this throughout the film. Go somewhere else. Like, if you don't like this reality, do something else.
It's a little bit of a misnomer. We keep saying star-crossed lovers, and they do eventually seem to fall in love with each other, but they don't end up together. Like, the end of this movie is a tragedy. You could say it's a tragedy. Like, she eventually kind of has this moment of self-realization. It's just like, no, I have this daughter, I have this husband or lover, and I'm just not going to go back with this guy and really start a life, because they never really started their life together despite them being married in Germany. So it's very fascinating that they eventually share a love, but they can never really express it to one another, and they really shouldn't be together. I mean, they're probably going to be terrible for each other. If they were a couple, they would probably be a horrible couple. I would like to think that they would find happiness and wonderment and all that. They're very damaged people, and they live in this damaged world, and this whole idea of them being, foreigners in another world, in another land. And this whole like, oh, if you don't like it, go home. And they're trying their best to make it here in Germany. And I want to say, like, she seems like she's second generation. She's got her folks there. It feels like they have emigrated, in their lifetime. I'm not sure about him. I guess so, because I guess he does say that he was born in Turkey, so he's emigrated in his lifetime. But it's got to be so rough for these people to be in this foreign land where, they talk about how he knows German better than he knows his own language. They talk about how awful he is at even speaking Turkish.
Well, that's the thing. They're both in ways strangers in strange lands wherever they go. They're both neither truly Turkish nor truly German. Both and neither. They're both. They don't belong to either society in a neat way, and that's part of the lost quality of the characters. But what I love about this film, and it's something that Akın does with a lot of his movies in different ways, is he finds very specific things that his characters are trapped in or dealing with, but they manage to be very generalizable to all of us. That sense of being lost, that sense of not belonging. He's very specific to the immigrant experience, and yet somehow the film widens it so that somebody like me, who was born in America and grew up in America, completely gets it and completely emotionally goes, oh, I know that feeling, a feeling I don't belong where I am. I mean, right now in America, certainly I feel like I really don't belong where I am. But I feel like really good storytellers, filmmakers, but novelists, whatever, can make it something very specific about a very different experience than yours, but yet somehow it universalizes. And I think this film does that wonderfully, that their lostness is all of our lostness. And I think it avoids the thing of being either a tragedy. It's for me, a truly deeply bittersweet film. And that's a quality that I feel like we get rarely. Things are often either truly tragic or they are happy endings. And I feel like this movie, I think you really caught something in that. I don't know that they belong together. I don't know that they would live happily ever after. I think she makes probably the right choice for her, and I think it may free him too, but it's really sad. It's really sad that they don't end up together, but it doesn't feel tragic, because tragic to me implies wrong. Like that something bad happen. And what I love about the end of the film is it breaks my heart. It makes me cry, but it doesn't feel like they're making a terrible mistake. And I feel like that's a rare quality in movies, and one that I deeply appreciate because I feel like that's more true to what most of us experience in life. You know, we part from people, relationships fall apart, things, and it's really sad, but it doesn't mean that it's wrong or tragic.
This notion of love comes up, right? And so in the film, Sibel's family is trying to approve of this choice for a husband and keeps asking, are you in love? Are you in love? But kind of nothing that the family seems to do to her seems to be out of love. Like it all seems to be about restriction and obedience and these kinds of things. Certainly not things that I look at as loving. And, and she's under these other like really extreme cultural weights that are carried over from Turkey to Germany. So she's a German citizen. She's, ostensibly playing by what? German rules, Western rules, but is still under these Turkish familial restrictions where she must marry and she must marry a Turk. There has to be love involved. Killing herself makes her, a pariah in her family. She will be, she slashes her wrist a couple of times in this film. The second time, her father burns all of her photos, which again speaks to some of this trans familiarity, the textual aspects of it, where, shutting off a like all depictions of a past self is what's happening when these photos are being burned. So she becomes this persona non grata with her family. There's a point even before the photos are burned where her own brother says, if you do this again, if you try to kill yourself again, I will kill you. So like, this is a lose-lose situation across the board. And it really leaves this question of like, what is love to this family? What does love mean for all this? And like, so we have Cahit, we have Sibel, I think really kind of like trying to determine what their own definitions of love are. They're approximating it. And I think we do see this in the end, that like making peace with yourself, I think is a piece of that, finding out what love is. And, but you can't always rely on these external cultural forces to bring happiness along with that individual clarity.
Well, the reason why they burn the photos and she slashes her wrists that last time, isn't that after he kills her lover and they find out that she had a lover, and like this whole idea of this marriage being a sham, that really comes out and suddenly they're disowning her, which is the thing that she was trying to not have happen the entire time, but she needed to live her life. She wanted to have that freedom, whether it was with Cahit or not, and Cahit is just this passageway for her to have that freedom. And really, I love that she knows what she wants and she's out there trying to get it.
Yeah, and it's one of the films I think the film deals with wonderfully. I mean, is her sexuality, and is that she wants to have sex, she wants to get laid, she wants to have fun, she wants to enjoy her body, and she comes from a culture where, and the film really depicts it with a complete hypocrisy. I mean, that's in all cultures, but that the male characters in the Turkish culture in the film are expected to go to brothels and have sex with be married, but have sex with as many women as they want. And that's fine. And if she, as a woman, even dares to want any sexuality in her life, she's a whore and she is dishonoring the family and she should die. I mean, better to have a dead daughter than a daughter who actually sleeps with more than one man. And it really captures the ugliness of that, which is, I think, runs through a lot of cultures in the world. And it's amazing. I mean, it's an amazing moment in the film when, after this marriage, she goes and sleeps with a stranger, and rather than dealing with it the way you'd see in an American film, where it's kind of, she doesn't know how she feels about it, or it's weird, or what, she's just walking through the street glowing. I mean, she had the best time, and it's so cool to see a film where a female character goes and gets laid and is like, I feel great. And there's no shame. And it's everything that her culture wouldn't allow, but by extension, let's face it, Western culture in general also doesn't allow. I mean, it's still changing. And it was such a sweet moment because I was used to from American films that we'd see her the next day and she'd go, "Oh, I slept with this guy. I didn't even know him. This is weird." And it was like, no, it was great. So I love that. That was like one of my favorite moments of the movie. But I do feel like, yeah, it really captures the complete hypocrisy about how we see sexuality. And certainly the Turkish sort of cultural stuff is very extreme versions of it. But once again, it seems generalizable out to how we judge other people's sexualities and how as a culture we still live by very strict lines of, oh, this is okay sexuality, this isn't. And, I mean, the film is very wonderfully subversive in a lot of ways because it will show an extreme case, but it's always like, yeah, and that's not only in Turkish families in Germany, it's kind of the world. Which is why I think, your points about it being a reading as a trans film is like, yeah, absolutely. Anything that doesn't fit neatly in the margins of what we're supposed to all be like, or that somebody decided that wasn't any of us. This film is about that and about not fitting in and that being what makes us great. And yet a world that tells us that's what makes us wrong.
And it is about slow transformation. I mean, one of the things I love about that scene of her walking and glowing, she's in her wedding dress. And this really hit me this last time through watching this, that, in that moment, she's like in complete, a cloud of white as she's doing her quote unquote walk of shame back. But it really sets this, it's her first moment of like complete independence. And as we see her do these walks, we see her do several walks throughout the rest of the film, but her clothing becomes progressively darker. So she's usually got like an element of white, up to when she kind of disguises herself in a more very masculine, like a crew cut kind of a tough guy kind of presentation. She's like in a white A shirt with black pants and maybe a gray pullover. So progressively throughout that, like as she's walking, her demeanor is just getting darker. And I mean, there's, I think, also an aspect of confidence, I think, that goes along with that. But certainly removing the purity that I think that the white is often meant to convey.
It's funny that there's this real world involvement as well when it comes to, so they ended up, she wasn't a really professional actress, and they ended up changing the character name to her name to make it a little bit easier on her. And so you already have that kind of mixing of the fictional and the non-fictional. And then right before, I think actually they were getting the film ready and were submitting it to film festivals and things. And there was a story in a German newspaper about, oh my God, this woman in this movie, she had done adult films before, and how terrible is this? And so they actually used that, though. I like that the filmmakers kind of were like, oh, well, now we have all of this quote unquote free press because it is such a scandal that this Turkish woman had been in porn. Well, let's put this movie out. And they just kind of used that to parlay it into some free publicity, which was good for them. I'm really glad for that. And then it was such a major coup when they ended up winning the Golden Bear. They did not expect that whatsoever, and helped jettison this movie into the consciousness so that, I mean, I'm not going to say that we wouldn't be talking about it right now if it hadn't won the Golden Bear, but it became such a major hit in Germany, in Turkey, not necessarily in English-speaking countries, but at least we know of it now, and it's pretty darn easy to find.
Keen is one of, I think, a number of filmmakers like this, where my perception at least is that he's incredibly well known and respected in Europe. I mean, he's like a famous filmmaker. And yet you talk to people here in the States, and a lot of people, I mean, even film lover people, have either never heard of him or like, well, I've heard the name, but I mean, and you do see that with a lot of amazing European or not even European, but non-US filmmakers, that we just don't get those films here unless you really seek them out. And it's why I was doing a show like this is great, because hopefully it gets a few more people interested. But it's shocking to me how many filmmakers I'm only discovering in my 40s, 50s, 60s that like you go to Europe and they're like, oh yeah, I love their films. And you're like, well, okay, we don't even know they exist. And, he's one of those people who he's won a lot of awards. He's gotten a lot of attention. His films are events, I think, much more in Europe. And they're like just not even on the radar here, which is just really sad.
I love that she tries to fit into this domestic space when she gets married, that actually starts to clean up the shithole apartment that he's in. I love he's so, he's just filthy. The way that he puts out his cigarette on his own fucking floor. It's like, what kind of an animal are you? And you just see the dishes and the beer cans and all that stuff just overflowing. And I liked on the commentary, they're like, well, we had to leave the Susie and the Banshees poster there so people knew that it was the same apartment because it gets transformed so radically after she kind of comes in. And that was the moment where I was just like, oh, okay, she's here. She's making her nest or whatever. Like, she's here to stay and, going to be this, tame woman. No, she's not. And I'm so glad for that. And going back to the Susie and the Banshees poster, I'm glad at the way that music plays such a role in this movie. And I love that mention on the commentary too, where he's like, I'm not just here making a greatest hits mixtape. I'm not Quentin Tarantino playing all of my favorite songs. I will play songs that the characters would listen to rather than what I like to listen to.
Yeah, the music is just fantastic. There's so many wonderful needle drops. And the one that I'm sitting with right now is when After Laughter hits. It's toward the end of the film, and she's in the carnival and she's about to experience like a horrible tragedy. It's like really, it's really, really coming. But, in the meantime, we get to see her right in the tilt-a-whirl. While after laughter, this jaunty little nostalgic number, which is a little out of step with the other like post-punk soundtrack we get.
The lyrics of that After Laughter Comes Tears completely foreshadows where the film is going.
Oh, yeah.
But the tone doesn't. So it's a really neat choice because it feels like, oh, everything is great. But if you actually listen to the song or when you've seen the film before, you go where you're about to go, it's like, oh, no, it's actually enjoy this because it's about to get really dark.
Yeah.
There's an interesting thing when you talked about her cleaning up the apartment that struck me, which is that there's a similarity they share in that they're both suicidal, but there's also a complete difference. Her suicidalness is somehow an act of wanting to live. It's like, I don't want to live if I can't be free, but she doesn't want to just die. She's actually somebody who wants to live, and it's almost an act of rebellion. It's like, well, if I can't live, then I'll die, but I would much rather live. And so like, to me, cleaning up the apartment, she takes care of herself. She keeps herself together. He is somebody who has given up. He's a wreck. He's a mess. He is truly, I think, a depressive person, or truly somebody without hope. Her suicidalness comes from they're both suicidal, but for completely different reasons. She's suicidal because she desperately wants to live and isn't being allowed to. He's suicidal because he sees no reason to live. So in a way, it's fascinating because they're sort of these twins, but they're really for very different reasons. And so her trying to find a way to take that shithole and make it nice, to me, fits that. She doesn't want to be miserable. She's just lived in a family where she's had no choice but to be miserable and sees no future but to be miserable, which is so different than he, who does have a choice and is clearly, alcoholic and just, he's lost his wife. And I have the feeling that that's what happened, is that he was in love. We're told really with this woman who sounds great, and she died. We don't ever quite, I don't think, know how. And that left him broken. But I think with that, he doesn't see like, yeah, I might as well die because I lost the love of my life. So there's no point. So it's a fascinating thing because they're both very similar in some ways, but boy, it comes from very different roots.
Yeah. And as you're speaking, I'm thinking about the generational difference between these characters because there's at least a micro generation between them age-wise. And, so I'm looking at him and, so he's probably a little bit older than I am, but probably still in that kind of Generation X kind of mindset, that like nihilist, like, I wear black because black is how I feel kind of a place, which, kind of comes with this, kind of a sense of cultural cynicism. And which, for me, I feel like I've had to, push back on, to unlearn in many ways. Because like what's on the other side of cynicism? It's just like there's nothingness. There's really no hope. And she's not coming from that same place at all. It's frustration and it's desperation for sure. I feel like if this was set in the US and it was dealing with characters that were in more of an environment that I'm familiar with, I would wonder if that generational divide would be a little more clear to me, as opposed to being, again, kind of removed into this like Turkish German space, liminal space that they're inhabiting.
Going back to the music thing too, I've really liked those little transitions that they have where they show the legit, traditional musicians and the singer, and they're on the banks of the river, and you get to see the mosque behind them, all of the carpets that they rented from the bazaar all below them and everything. I really was not sure what to think about those the first time I saw them, but I'm just like, well, these are more than just act breaks. But I really like what they're doing there, and especially that you can see time passing with them, that, we start in the morning and then the last one, I believe, is in the evening. So you get to see this whole, shift in that. And it's such a nice way to kind of bring all this together. I'm kind of amazed at how well this movie works when you hear that audio commentary and hear them talking about how, oh yeah, the original version, and I'm not talking about an assembly cut. They're like, the original version of this was like 4 hours long, and then we started to trim it back. And just to hear all of the scenes, and I believe there are deleted scenes on at least one of the DVD versions of this. I think I ended up buying 3, which was a real shame that I had to do that, but one's got this feature, one's got that, one's got the commentary. So good luck. Maybe they'll finally put this out someplace with all of those features all together. But to hear them talking about like, oh yeah, we had to trim this, and this scene is out, and this scene is out. And just the way that also helped. There's a lot of jump cuts in this. Like you're talking about that very violent sex scene between Cahit and Zimran, I think the woman that was kind of in his life for a while too. And just like we were jumping through there like crazy, or some of the violence that they are able to just really amp it up with those harsh cuts as well, because there's a ton of violence in this, and so much of it has to do with Cahit, and just he seems to be a walking fist most of the time.
And there's a suddenness to the violence that I feel like isn't what it feels like in most movies. I feel like movies, with some reason, there's often a build-up to violence. It's a way that filmmakers will create tension. It's like, oh, this is getting worse and worse. This movie feels more like my experience of life is just when something shockingly violent, or it sort of is like, what just happened? I mean, whether it's her cutting her wrist in that bar, or when he does kill the guy in the bar. I mean, it's like it happens before you even have a chance to go, what? And that feels very real to me, and it's not very something we see in films a lot. Just because I think it's tradition, and it makes sense that you'd want to milk those moments, but by really refuting that, I think it makes the violence in this feel very real in a very disturbing way, because it feels like, oh, that's kind of almost too close to the way you probably experience it in real life.
Listening to the commentary that charts out some of the things that happen, some of the scenes, the nightclub scene in particular, where, they didn't really inform every participant about what was going to happen. So it really makes me wonder, in the scene where Cahit punches Nico and kills him in one punch, by the way, speaking of a walking fist, did everybody in the room know that was going to happen? Right? Like, did they inform that? Is that energy of the other people who are in the scene not quite understanding what they're seeing, is that coming through? I would imagine probably so, right? Like it really adds to the tension of the nightclub scene for sure. And, and it's just this is not a direct relation, but I'm reminded of like how many times we see bloody hands. I mean, we see both Cahit and Sibel, like their hands are bloody constantly in this film. Well, just what an interesting motif that is.
You hear you say that, and I've seen the film 6 times, I think now. Part of what makes this a great film, and I think a lot of great films have this, is the density of detail where you can keep seeing things. Because I'm listening to you guys talking about it, And I'm going, oh, I hadn't thought about that. Oh, I hadn't noticed that. And any film that I can have seen this many times and then go, oh yeah, blood on hands, that is definitely an intentional motif. To be able to keep discovering layers, I think is something that really wonderful films often have, because there's so much in them that there's always a new way to read. I mean, you're reading of it as a trans story. It's like, wow, I want to go back and rewatch the film with that in mind. And I think this film is so rich, the characters are so rich, what they go through is so rich, that and the way it's told, that it affords that. It affords the ability to go back and go, wow, I hadn't even noticed that whole element. And that's exciting. I think that as a film viewer, I love that.
And especially for a film that's, what, 20, 23 years old at this point, right?
That bookending thing of the songs. It's one of the other things about the movie that I love, among the many things, is how it does things that I would think would make me feel a certain way and don't. Like, that's a very Brechtian thing in a way, to have the whole story, this very naturalistic story about this intense emotional story of these two people, bookended by traditional sounding Turkish music being performed right into camera in a very theatrical, stagey way on the banks of the river with Istanbul in the back. It's like, you would think of that as a distancing technique. If somebody described it, it would sound like, oh, that's going to take you out of the movie intentionally. And it's the filmmaker saying, we're telling you a story. This isn't real. And yet its actual effect is the opposite. Instead of being this weird distancing Greek chorus, to me, it sort of goes, it makes it more real and brings it into it and makes you feel like, yes, we're telling you a story, but come into our story. And it's something that I feel like the film was full of things that if I read a description and a review, I would think I would feel one way, and seeing the movie, it operates in just the opposite. And I think that's also one of the most interesting things filmmakers can do, is take a device and not have it make you feel what you think you would. And I love those songs. And somehow they add the emotion, and somehow they make the film feel more real and more complete, instead of feeling like, oh, of the filmmaker commenting on the story I'm telling. And I don't even know why. It's the nature of the music. It's the way he shot it. It's the humanity and passion in the music. I don't know. I can't even give great reasons, but I know that that's the kind of thing, if I read about it, I would go, oh yeah, that kind of Greek chorusy thing. And it isn't. And I don't know why it isn't.
There's a musical journey that's happening here where, he's got his world of post-punk and arguably danceable post-punk, because he's listening to Depeche Mode, right? He's listening to Sisters of Mercy. But he says, I don't dance, and he refuses to dance to more traditional Turkish music during the wedding. She makes him dance. Cocaine helps, obviously, but she makes him dance up to, and he dances more and more and more as the film goes. And we're, going between his Western ideals. This band that we see is kind of the Turkish chorus throughout the entire film. But then it all comes together over this end closing sequence, the end credits, where we've got Chalk Talk's Life's What You Make It performed by a Turkish musician, right? And so really bringing this all together in this unified presentation over those closing credits is, wow, what a way to end that musical journey of this film.
Well, and a nice callback, too, because it's the psychiatrist at the hospital. It's like, have you ever heard of the? And I love that. It's like, you don't expect that coming out of a doctor's mouth, where it's like, oh, yeah, you know this song? It's like, what, sir? You know these songs? But
right.
The older I get, the more I'm like, oh, yeah, these people are my contemporaries. Okay, yeah. Yeah, you're talking about the tension, and I think the most tense scene for me is when it's Cahit and I think his brother-in-law, who's played by the director's real brother, I think, in the film, and two other guys, and they are playing some game, and all the guys except for Cahit are just talking about these women and who they want to go with and all this kind of stuff, and he's just like, hey, why don't you go back to your wives or whatever. And it's like all of a sudden the tension, like you said, just goes from 0 to 100. It's like, what the fuck did you just say? And I'm surprised that fists weren't flying in that scene, but man, oh man, there's another guy who just immediately stands up and starts putting his finger into Cahit's face, and it's like, wow, that is pretty telling, you were talking, Keith, about the whole, like, oh yeah, the guys go to the whorehouses, but the women, no, they have to stay as pure as the driven snow. I love that immediate scene afterwards with Sibel and all of the women and them talking and really talking shit. And then I loved on the commentary where Fatih was saying, like, yeah, people didn't believe this. They didn't want to know that women actually talk this way. And he's like, they probably talk worse in real life than we had on this film.
I do love that moment where the women are talking about, with like the other women saying, they're talking about her new husband. They say, does he lick? And she says, like a cat. And they're like, oh, mine doesn't like a cow. It is mooing. And it is great because, again, yes, the film is this embrace of female sexuality and like the fact that men don't want to deal with female sexuality and don't want to think it exists. And the film is saying, not only does it exist, it's ecstatic and amazing and wonderful. And, get the fuck over it. And that scene is, encapsulates that because it's like all these Turkish women who've had to pretend that, they are like not sexual beings. And they get together and they're like, oh, yeah, like they're the men, it feels like the male sexuality is very posturing. It feels like, in the film in general, particularly the Turkish male sexuality is very like, it's not really about loving sex. It's about like proving to other men what a man you are, much more than it's about enjoying sex. Whereas the women in the film, it's like, no, they like sex. It's not about proving anything to anybody. They like feeling good. And that is just, I think that probably, again, transcends culture. I see that in our culture, that male sexuality as defined by certainly the culture I grew up in a lot of it's very performative. And I think the film captures that, and that whereas hers is not at all. And and the little glimpse we get of the other women is not at all. And the women in general are just so much more human in the film. I mean, Sibel's mother, is the one person in her family who isn't interested in judging her sexuality, but also just in judging her, period. She just wants to love her, and it's the men who can't get past image and honor and being a man and and the women are all like, yeah, that's all bullshit. I don't care about that. I want to deal on a human level, which again, yes, I think that's probably a big thing in Turkish society, but it's certainly a big thing in American society. So, I feel like that's kind of wonderful. I mean, it's funny. The film is full of very political and social and subversive in the best way ideas without ever feeling like a tract or ever feeling it's actually making a point. So many of the best films that make a lot of great points never feel like, we're teaching you a lesson. And then at the end of the movie, they've actually made you think about a lot of stuff. And this is one of those movies that's completely fun. I mean, that's the other thing. It's a really tragic film full of violence. It's really funny and really enjoyable. And it's actually an enjoyable film to watch. And yet at the end of it, you're heartbroken and having to think about the world you live in. And that to me is a remarkable thing when any kind of story or art can do that.
And then you get to go back in and dig in. One of the things I enjoyed about being able to really take my time at this time is being able to stop it and look up what the names meant. So there's a scene early on where they say, first names are very more meaningful than last names in Turkish culture. And I was like, I think that might be kind of counter to what I'm understanding about Western culture, right? Like it seems like your family name, that tradition seems to be more important than whatever your actual first name is. So it made me go in and look up, what does Cahit mean? It means work, effort, perseverance. What does Sibel mean? It means oracle. Right? A revealer. So we've got Cahit, the worker, and we've got Sibel, who's the revealer, the shower. That dynamic was so interesting to think about, looking at the journeys of these characters as they go through. Even to look at, as there's a scene in mid-film as they're driving together and there's something written on the back of window of their car. It's like a Volkswagen Rabbit or something like that, right? And it says, Hepsi senin mi, Hepsi seninmi, which means, is it all yours? And if you can read more about what that means, there's songs called that, So there's much more rich text to go into with that. But, it is like there for a significant part of that scene, you're being asked by the screen directly in front of your face, is this all yours? It's confrontational to you, the viewer.
It's fascinating about his name meaning worker, because there's this whole concept in Germany of Gastarbeiter, I believe it is. My German is worse than my English. And it's this whole program of, we are having this big economic boom. We need to bring in foreigners with ways different from our own to work in our country. And a lot of them were Turks. And this brought up the whole idea, like in the media, when they were talking about this film, it's like, is this about guest workers? And then people are just like, guest workers, it doesn't even exist. We're German. Like, get over it. We're freaking German. We're not guests in your country. We're part of this country now.
Certainly is timely for us here.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Somehow, most great art is like really timely whenever you see it, wherever you see it. That's what makes it kind of amazing, is like probably this movie 50 years from now will still be completely meaningful and completely speak to whatever culture you see it in. And, if you saw this movie in the UK, or if you saw it in whatever, South Africa or Japan, or it would be speaking to something about, because it's working on such a deep human level. And I think the deeper something goes on a human level, the more it transcends and like applies to wherever you are. And it's that weird contradiction that art has. Like, the more specific to a character, more specific to a time, more specific to a place it gets, the more universal it becomes, not less, which is kind of one of those amazing paradoxes I've never fully understood, but it does seem to be true that, really great art that is very specific somehow then becomes very universal. And if it's not very specific, it also often fails to be universal too. It just feels like, oh, blah. It doesn't mean something, but I've been reading some like Charles Dickens lately, and it's like, it's so specific to England in that moment. And yet because of that, I'm seeing all this stuff about, the United States in 2026. And this film has that feeling of like, yeah, whenever and wherever you see it, it's going to speak about your culture and your people and people you know.
Whoa. I just got a text from Vin Vendors. He says you're talking way too much about politics and art.
Oh, Vim.
That was such a strange... I've not done a deep dive into that. I just was like, what? What did he say? What happened?
Yeah.
I was like... It was a little disturbing.
Yeah, and then, I think somebody else, it might have been Michelle Yeoh, is just like, oh, no, we don't talk about politics and this stuff. I'm like, okay, what is the problem here, folks? You nod twice if you're under threat right now. All right, well, let's go ahead and take a break and play a preview for next week's show right after these brief messages.
Je faisais partie d'une bande. Unie pour le meilleur et surtout pour le pire.
Lâchez-moi!
Je crois qu'il faut dissoudre ce groupe ou les reprendre en main de la plus ferme des manières.
Je peux transformer n'importe quel garçon violent en être docile et civilisé. J'ai mes méthodes.
Où sommes-nous, capitaine?
Nulle part.
Capitaine. Qu'est-ce qui nous arrive, Tommy? Je sais pas. Fais-moi le malin, capitaine. On se croyait immortel. C'était comme une hallucination prémonitoire. La plus belle des hallucinations. La plus belle des hallucinations.
That's right. We'll be back next week with a look at Bertrand Mandico's The Wild Boys. Until then, I want to thank my hosts, Keith and Rain. So, Keith, what has been keeping you busy, sir?
Oh, trying to be a happy person. That's been the biggest thing. I've kind of been in this kind of quasi-semi-retired part of my life where I'm not chasing work. I'm like, when things are happening, I'm working with friends or teaching or doing stuff like that. and, standing on bridges with signs opposing ICE. And it's actually been as much as part of my time as anything right now. Is, my wonderful wife is very much an activist. And so I let her find what's going on. I'm like, okay, I'll go along. See if there's any way to help our country start to go in a better direction is sort of the best thing I can be doing. So doing some of that, and just trying to look out the window and enjoy what's good out there in the face of a lot of things that are creepy and bad.
Well, thank you for doing that, and keep fighting the good fight, sir.
I do hope that there'll be more resistance that can happen. I think what happened in Minneapolis was incredibly moving and powerful. And if the whole nation can take on that energy, maybe we can come through this okay. So anyway, sorry, don't mean to get preachy or whatever, but we are at a time where I wish we had more what Europe has in terms of a history of general strikes or things like that. But, I'm hoping there'll be more of that kind of organizational stuff going on. Anyway, sorry, lecture ended. Sorry.
No, it's okay. My phone's blowing up. Vim is really mad right now. Let's just stop him from talking.
Put him on mute.
And Rain, what's going on in Charm City?
Well, Baltimore is continuing to be, we're just finally thawing out of a really, really, really deep freeze. The longest stretch of cold weather we've had in a long time. So starting to get out into the streets, which is nice because, as noted, that's more and more necessary. And, I'm feeling pretty optimistic about the future given everything. There's a lot of work ahead of us. And I've got a lot of cool things coming up this year. And by the time this comes out, I should have my blog back up and running. I'm continuing to do the Hopkins Press podcast, and I'm looking at starting a new radio show and interview situation that you can find on my website, which is just at rahne.com, RAHNE.com.
Well, thank you so much, folks, for being on the show. Thanks to everybody for listening. Do you want to support physical media and get great movies in the mail? Head over to scarecrow.com and try Scarecrow Video's incredible rent-by-mail service, the largest publicly accessible collection in the world. You'll find films that are entirely unavailable elsewhere. Get what you want when you want it without the scrolling. And yes, they have Head On. If you want to hear more of me shooting off my mouth, check out some of the other shows that I work on. They are all available at weirdingwaymedia.com. Thanks especially to our Patreon community. If you want to join the community, visit patreon.com/projection booth. Every donation we get helps the projection booth take over the world.
Since I get my head round you, come around catching spots.